week, Lyrebird owners got access to 2 new devices that Matthew's now including in what he calls the Lyrebird Multiverse. They are Mathematical Mark II, which is a functional clone of the Make Noise Maths Eurorack unit, and Flipbook, which is an intricate take on the question, can we have an XY controller in blocks? I wish I could give you a point-by-point description of exactly how both of these things work, but I'm just struggling to catch up myself. But I did want to give you a basic overview of what they are and how they work, as well as to show you a setup that I've found both easy to understand and quite powerful. To start off with, Mathematical is a signal manipulator. In one of its most basic forms, it simply takes in a signal and allows you to manipulate that using these various knobs. So the way I've set it up to accomplish that is very simple. I've got the pulsar out from Lyrebird coming into signal 1 on Mathematical. And I've got out 1 going back into Lyrebird at source 4. Pretty much an arbitrary choice, but I think a sensible one. It allows me to crossfade between the random source, and if I dial this knob fully clockwise, it's the mathematical source coming out of 4. I've also patched the out into this scope here. So if you notice, the pattern that we're getting here is very much like, if not identical, to the pattern that's coming out of the pulsar, which is, of course, what we've got going in. I've got the signal knob here set to signal 1. We've got a knob here called fade, and it basically allows us to crossfade between what the pulsar is doing and what Mathematical itself can do. So if we start crossfading in Mathematical, you can see we're having an effect on the signal, the pulsed in signal, but we're basically flattening it out, which isn't very interesting. So let's turn on Mathematical's internal cycle mode. In other words, let's have it generate its own pulse. We're filling the screen basically with a dense pattern here, which is controlled by the rise and fall rates, which are set here. So they were set to fast as possible, and now I'm slowing them down, and you can see what we're getting. So this is entirely mathematical, using its rise and fall settings and also its shape settings here. So if we zero shape out, we get that triangle. And we can adjust the shape of the triangle differently to get sawtooth and other sorts of ways. And if we crank the shape up, we start to get somewhere between exponential and logarithmic curves. In the middle, we're at linear. Okay, so if we back off the fade a little bit and crossfade between these two things, you can see that MW pattern there from the pulsar being mixed now with the rise and fall rates. Key is an interesting knob. In some settings, it can basically speed up the rate. You can see that the pattern is getting denser here, but if we lower it down here, it opens up a bit, indicating that it's a slower action. So that's pretty handy. And the pattern that we're generating is coming out of source 1. So back here in Lyrebird, if we crossfade it to the external input, you can see that we're controlling this now with Mathematical. So if we speed it up with the key knob, you can see the meter speeding up there. And if we back this off completely and get back to our MW, let's There we go. Now you can see that this light here is matching the pulsing coming out of this light here. So basically we could use this as just an alternative route to be able to crossfade between the pulsar and random. Obviously that's kind of the least interesting thing we can do with it. What's more interesting is when we start crossfading it in here, and we can get a very different signal, and we can actually back off the signal and blend it back in with the random source with this knob. Before we get into any more of that and listen to what that effect is, let's look at Flipbook for a minute. Flipbook is an XY controller, but it's not like any I've ever seen before. You can definitely click and draw on the field, but it's set up in an interesting way. If you left click, you can draw in the X direction, but not in the Y direction. To erase what you've done, you simply left click once. If you right click, you can draw in the Y direction. And it, of course, follows the rate at which you draw. And again, if you left click, then you can erase. If you've got a mouse with two distinct buttons, both of which you can hold at the same time, you can actually draw in circles in both X and Y at the same time. I can't do that with my one-button Apple mouse, so I can't demonstrate that. But quickly to run over what you've got here is that once you've drawn something and you can record the rate, you can then modify that rate with the X rate here. And you can also morph between the X direction and the Y direction with the morph knob. At which point the Y rate starts to have some meaning. You can convert it completely to Y. Now if you notice down here, you've got all these flashing lights. Basically this is X out, this is Y out, this is Y rate out, and X rate out. They basically don't have anything to do with drawing. From 5 to 8, what these are indicating is that the X and Y lines here are being crossed. In other words, a zero crossing is happening, so a trigger event is occurring. And if you morph back into something diagonal here, you can see that that all the quadrants are responding, or at least in this case 3 are. So that's what this is indicating. The idea was that with the outs 5 through 8, you could set each one to a different 4 different things that would respond to trigger inputs. And interestingly, you can adjust the position of that zero crossing line with the X and Y split lines. You notice also that there are 8 different pages, each of which can have a different pattern drawn on them, and may still have one drawn on from previous use. And you can't crossfade between these pages, but you can, of course, automate switching between them. And each one has 100 seconds worth of recording time, so you could effectively put 8 different patterns in here and switch between them at the rate of once every 100 seconds and access 800 different seconds of movement. In practice, the simplest way to use this is as an unusual modulator. Comes with a bunch of presets that Matthew's already loaded it with. And of course you can change the rate and the morphing and fiddle with the pattern in all sorts of ways. The functions here are optimized for taking advantage of some drawing that you've put in lots of complicated different ways. What I've simply done with it to date is hooked up the main out also to source 8 in on mathematical. So if I raise the knob here on mathematical source 8 to show the external signal, I'm basically capturing whatever is going on this 1 meter and sending it over to mathematical. And then I've got another modulator for the mathematical knobs that comes from outside mathematical. Let's get on to how I've hooked mathematical into Lyrebird and how I've discovered to use it. In this first patch down here, ebb and flow with maths, I connected source 4 here to the wave of the mod oscillator and turned the volume down on the regular oscillator. If I turn that down, you'll be able to hear what we've got going on here. If I turn that up, blend it into mathematical, then with the crossfade knob, start blending in some of mathematical's own signal. We're now controlling the signal with the rise and fall knobs, and you can see that it's going nuts over here on the wave. We appear to be hearing simply the speed with which we're modulating this wave knob as opposed to the wave itself. There's something going on there with both of them. You can change the sound by changing aspects of that wave. But when you really crank it up, size and the multiply knob do have some effect, but you can hear when we divide that wave way down below to the subaudible range, we're just hearing So obviously it would be interesting to modulate the rise and fall knobs. So that's where, when Flipbook arrived, I turned to that. So to get some action going here, I'm going to wiggle a little bit. I can see I'm getting something good on 2 there, so I'm going to select that and now Flipbook that's modulating the rise and fall of mathematical, which is changing the rate of that signal and giving us the sound here in the mod source. So that really all we're hearing is the modulation of the wave, not the wave itself. I guess I can't be certain of that. With those basic connections made, let me just step through a few of the patches that I made using these connections and just fiddling with stuff. like the pitch tonality of this particular one quite a lot, and I discovered that I could actually get tuning out of it with the fine-tune knob, or any of the knobs really. But fine-tuning seemed pretty good. So I dragged in another modulator that I just found in the Reactor user library. It's basically a recordable slider from Peter Dines, and I set it up to control Lyrebird via the IC send. If you drop that down there, you'll see that you can find Lyrebird and find a vast list of Lyrebird's controls. Let me slide that over a bit. There they are. I can't distinguish what any of these panel mods mean, but I've found almost all of the controls that I've so far wanted to actually adjust, and in this case, panel, mod, fine, mod oscillator, fine. Yep, that's the one. So what I've done here is drag that instrument in, and in order to label it, we went down here to the instrument, and I've set this up to the mod fine, so I'm going to just change the label here, and I'm going to turn the switch on.